Madeline.
Sienna.
Adrian.
Eva.
Texas is famous for its substantial use of death row in criminal cases. The state accounts for more than a third of all executions in the United States since 1976. The use of capital punishment is decided by a jury, which allows for some subconscious bias when debating the sentence.
We originally became interested in the topic after finding a database about death row. It contained information spanning from the offender's level of education to a transcript of their last words.
We first wanted to test how the race of the victim affected the jury's decision to impose the death penalty. However, the tests we had learned at this point were not applicable to the data we had collected.
So we flipped our project and instead isolated Texas, a state well known for its use of the death penalty, to see if the race of the offender affected whether or not they received capital punishment in comparison to the whole of the United States.
We got our information from a variety of sources.
The Texas Department for Criminal Justice provided the data we needed for our sample.
And we got the information for the national race proportions from the Death Penalty Information Center.
Using the data we collected from these sources, we were able to run a z-test for proportion, comparing the data from Texas to the national data.
We randomly selected over 150 points of data from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and compiled a list of offenders, identifying them as white and non-white. Using the two resources, we compiled a list of white and non-white offenders and put them in a table to compare them in a proportions test.
We designated P1 to be national data and P2 to be Texas's data.
We ran two proportions tests that are reciprocals, one right-tailed test for the proportion of white offenders and one left-tailed test for non-white offenders.
Because the tests are reciprocals of each other, the outcomes were the same, so we're only going to show one of the tests.
We chose an alpha value of 0.05 for both of our tests.
We plugged the proportions into our calculator and got a critical value of 1.64, a z-score of 2.68, and a p-value of 0.0036.
Which led us to the conclusion that there is enough evidence to support the claim that there is a lower proportion of white people put on death row in Texas than the national proportion of white people put on death row at an alpha level of 0.05.
As with any project, there were many obstacles to work around or overcome.
The first and biggest obstacle was the failure of our initial idea of testing the connection between the race of the victim and death row sentence. We lost a lot of time and work.
Another big problem was the inconsistency of logging on behalf of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Some records did not include the offender's race, so we simply had to skip over them.
Also, the data pulled from Texas spans a slightly different time period. Texas began logging its data in 1982, 6 years after the national stats began recording.
In addition, our research and testing simplified our data collection into just two variables, white and non-white. Even the national statistics simplified the race of death row inmates into just 4 rudimentary categories. This is problematic because it does not fully encapsulate the effect that race might have on a person when it comes to criminal justice.
Also, we didn't take into account the other factors that might sway the jury, including sex of the offender and severity of the crime.
Finally, we did not take out the statistics of Texas from the national data. This means the Texas stats inflated the national data. However, this does not take away from our conclusion because the removal of Texas's data would actually increase the disparity and further prove our hypothesis.
Because we got a test statistic in the shaded region and a p-value of much less than our alpha value, we were able to comfortably support our claim that Texas sends a higher proportion of people of color to death row than the national average.
It can be assumed that this discrepancy is caused by a complex combination of factors that our research doesn't even begin to analyze.
Far more research must be done to determine exactly what those factors might be.
People of color face a disproportionate amount of bias and mistreatment, and capital punishment is just one example.
This project has opened our eyes to the world of research and inspired us to further explore the multitude of criminal justice disparities. We got our information from a variety of.
And we got the information for the national race proportions from the Death Penalty Information Center.
The Texas Department for Criminal Justice provided.
We got our information.
Also,